I think it's the biggest scam in human history. It's totally ridiculous. And our paper is just one of many, many papers that point seriously against the. I mean, as you can see, our paper calls the entire carbon dioxide philosophy into question.
Jonathan Cohler of Cohler Associates has recently written an academic paper. It's entitled A Critical Reassessment of the Anthropogenic CO2 Global Warming Hypothesis, and it's written together with David Leggett, Franklin Soon, and Willie Soon, and the lead author is Grok3 Beta, which is an AI engine. The claim of the paper is that the IPCC models, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models, are contradicted by the evidence. So, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
Tell me about how you got this team together and what your own contribution was.
Sure.
And particularly who Grok3 Beta is as well as part of that team.
Okay. So Grok3 Beta is beta refers to the fact that it was in the beta test cycle of the software, is one of the leading AI systems in the world. In fact, on almost all of the benchmarks at the moment, it's the best one of the public-facing general AI systems. And that's made by a company called XAI, which is I think recently they purchased or are about to purchase X as well. So they're part of that group. So it's the company called XAI, and they make the product called Grok. And Grok 3 is the version number, and beta means it was the beta test version. I think it's now out of beta as of maybe a week ago or something. But so that's the AI system. The other people are Willie Soon, who's a good friend of mine for the last few years, a very famous climate scientist, and David Legates, who's another very famous climate scientist. And Franklin Soon is Willie's son, and he helped us with some of the more logistical stuff in the paper. And Willie said, "Hey, we should list Franklin in the paper too." So those are the authors. But yes, Grok3 Beta was the lead author because it did really the hard work of doing virtually all the writing. Almost every word is literally written by it. And not just that, but synthesizing the information. The paper is what's called a review paper. If you see at the top, it says review, which means it's a literature synthesis type paper. It's not a paper where we did a new experiment with new data. Okay. It's a review of existing papers, all of which have been previously peer reviewed and published. Some of them quite old. Some of the papers I think were from the late 90s, and some of them quite new from 2023, 2024. So and in the process, it pulled together papers and it wrote stuff, and then we went back and forth with it. Just like it's exactly the same as if you'd go back and forth with human being co-authors. I mean, the only difference is since it did most of the work, we said it should be listed as the lead author, which is typically the case. You see a lot of science papers where you'll see 40 authors listed, right? And really, probably the guy listed number one is the one who did most of the work. And then the other guys were consulted and, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? But so we thought, it was appropriate to have Grok3 Beta listed as the lead author.
So Grok3 Beta did the writing of the paper, but tell me, what was the actual process? Did you feed in information to it? And did you in any way bias it in some respect? I mean, how does the actual nitty-gritty process of putting the data before Grok3 Beta work?
So it's actually the reverse of what you're saying.
Yeah.
All the AI systems are trained on what's called their training data, and the training data is inherently heavily biased. It's got if anything, any subject matter that has any political, social, or controversial overtones is heavily left-wing bias because the media is heavily left-wing bias and the existing literature is biased, and whatever is a majority or a wide majority view is an inherent bias, right? In science, science doesn't depend on politics. Okay, politics sometimes depends on science, but science doesn't depend on politics. And so,
Well, it
when you
shouldn't.
say it shouldn't, right? The science is about hypotheses and data, and so it turns out that the corpus of training data that exists is just what exists. You know, take all the newspapers in the world, all the published papers in the world. It has virtually all of them in there, okay? And that's biased. So the only way you get an unbiased evaluation out of it is through a process called, nowadays in the business they call it chain of thought reasoning. In human beings we talk about it as critical thinking. Okay, and the only way you get critical thinking is by asking questions and saying, what about this, what about that, hey, what do you think of this, what do you think of that? And that's why you have co-authors to bounce things off of each other. So we didn't have to tell it what's out there, but we would say, okay, what is the latest on isotopic analyses of CO2 in the atmosphere? And it'll say, well, there's this paper, there's this paper, there's that paper, there's the other paper. Um, and and then and then we'd say, well, okay, so this paper contradicts that, and this one is much newer, right? And said, yeah, and okay, you can analyze. You see anything wrong with that paper? By the way, the other thing you can do with Grok is you can say to it, um, even after it's written the paper. So it'll take a pass at writing it. And then you'll say, go back and check your work, just like, by the way, you would say to a human being, go back and check your work and see if anything in there was mathematically or logically inconsistent. And it might find two or three things, um, which, by the way, if you search through peer reviewed science papers, you'll find the same kind of things. One example in atmospheric science is we often talk about gigatons of carbon, which is notated as GTC, right? Well, people all the time confuse gigatons of carbon with gigatons of carbon dioxide, and many published papers make the same confusion. And virtually every journalist makes the confusion because they have no idea what they're talking about, right? So, um, it can slip through the cracks. And so, in one instance, it found itself that it had given a figure of gigatons of carbon dioxide when the appropriate number was gigatons of carbon, right? And so I said, oh, okay, I found this, and I had to fix that. Right? So, but
Okay,
yeah, it's
so
this,
how does it work in this way? If Grok goes and looks at the mass of papers
right.
that are out there and the data which is out there, most of that, I mean, I think that you'd have to say that the vast majority of papers which are written on climate change let's call it the standard view, the IPCC view. And if it is gathering that data, how does it come to a conclusion which would be contrary to what, let's say, the mainstream view is? How do we
Okay,
get that?
so that view that the majority of the vast majority, first of all, is false. But leave that aside for a moment. Um, if you looked at it, I mean, it's true in a sense and it's false in a sense. If you looked at all climate science papers written in the last 30, 40 years, um, the the I'd say it's probably true that the majority, not the vast, but the majority of them endorse things that the IPCC says, and the IPCC is not a science organization; it's a governmental political organization. Okay, so I believe that's true, but that's kind of irrelevant. What's relevant when you zoom in on a specific thing that you're talking about, okay, the number of papers drops dramatically. Okay, climate science is a humongous area. Okay, however, the area of isotopics, studies about the isotopic evidence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, I don't know,
Yeah.
I would be surprised if there are 100 papers on that. And certainly the significant ones, I would say the number is maybe 10. So it's actually a very small number of papers, okay, have been written by an even smaller number of authors. And if you believe the propaganda about the IPCC, well, they've decided and they have thousands of scientists and it's the leading science. All of those are lies, right? It's not a science organization. They don't have thousands of scientists. The IPCC reports are not peer reviewed. All of those are just lies that are promulgated daily in the press, right? What is true is it's a governmental organization. That's in its title, the Intergovernmental Panel. Everything it published, all its published assessments, which are not science paper, they are assessments,
Yeah.
are designed for political consumption, and the authors are overruled and edited by the government. So forget about that for a moment. Science papers are peer reviewed and published in peer reviewed science journals, which that peer review process involves other scientists looking at it and giving feedback and approving or disapproving or asking for edits or that kind of thing. And there's all kinds of problems with peer review too, but at least peer review involves scientists checking on science, right? So if you want to refer to a paper, that's good. That nobody reputable would list as a reference an assessment by the IPCC because that is not science. An assessment is an opinion. Science is never opinion. There's no opinion in science. In science, you say, we did this experiment, here was the data, here's the result we got, and we think this result points possibly to this type of conclusion or ways in this direction. You'll notice the wording in a science paper is not the same as the headlines you see on X or on Facebook or whatever, right? Because headlines are meant to be short and attention grabbing. But you go actually read the science papers, they're much more circumspect about what they say. So, for example, in the conclusion in the abstract here that Grok wrote, and we didn't touch a word, it was perfect, says we conclude that the anthropogenic CO2 global warming hypothesis lacks empirical substantiation, overshadowed by natural drivers such as temperature feedbacks and solar variability, necessitating a fundamental re-evaluation of current climate paradigms. Now, if you read what that says, it's indisputable. Nobody's disputed this yet. Okay, what most people don't understand, for example, is that most of the conclusions, I'd say more than 90% of the conclusions in the IPCC assessment reports, AR6 being the latest one, are assessments, not science, they're assessments based on the output of models. Models are by definition in science not evidence. Okay? Models are hypotheses. You can't have a hypothesis being evidence because now you've got a circle, right? So models are never evidence. And what we're talking about in this paper is empirical stuff. And we also have, we were very careful to see that there was a balance. When Grok gave its first pass, it probably shot out like 30 papers at us and said, here's 30 papers and it wrote the outline, it did all the stuff. And then we would say, how about, have you seen this paper? And if it hadn't seen it, it looked, and we said, okay, incorporate that into your analysis because this is a new one on the same subject. And like I said, this myth, this fiction that overwhelming majority and thousands of paper is a lie. If you focus on a particular area, let me give you another even better example. One of the areas we covered is called total solar irradiance, TSI for short. That is the study of figuring out how much energy is coming from the sun and whether it's going up or down. Okay. Now you would think, oh, this is easy. No, it's not easy. It's only been studied and measured by satellites for the last 30 or so years. Okay. And the problem is the satellites go up in the air for like 10 years and then they come down, right? So during that time, there have been a collection, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but 9, 10, 12 satellites. So the job of figuring out how to marry the data from one satellite to another to produce one continuous record, because if you want to say has the sun gotten any warmer, right? You have to marry together all these different data sets, okay? So that
Yeah.
process of marrying together the data sets of the multiple satellites is an extremely complicated, unsolved problem. Now, what the IPCC did is they took a paper that was written, I believe, back around 1998. The details are, in the paper, but and it's a method called PMOD, PMOD, and that's the one method. And they said this method of figuring out how much energy is coming from the sun is the only one we're going to use, and it shows that it hasn't changed. So they chose one method. Now,
Yeah.
for decades, it's been well known that there are many other methods of putting those satellites together. And in fact, in 2023, a group of about 40 scientists put out a paper saying we've come up with 27 different methods of putting this data together. And we can't say which one is the absolute. And PMOD was one of those 27. Okay, and we can't say which one is the one or the answer because there's no way that we don't know that yet. However, the ones that we sort of think are probably right better maybe are this group of 8. And furthermore, depending on which one it is, it could account for all the warming we've seen in the last 100 years, half of the warming, part of the warning, or none. Right? So you have this data saying, look, there's 27. And I've talked to the scientists involved in that paper, and they're now saying we actually have another 13. So we think the number of possibilities is really 40, but they haven't published that yet. So, but this 27 they published back in, and was peer reviewed back in 2023. So you have the IPCC saying, PMOD, it's the only one, it doesn't change. That's the answer. You shall fall in line. That is essentially a lie. PMOD is not a lie. It's a valid method, but it's not the only one. And depending on which one is the correct one, and we don't know the answer to that, then that's it. So the notion that there's these thousands of papers, no, there's one paper that the consensus, which is meaningless in science, but that's what the consensus depends on. Because if the correct one is the one that accounts for all the warming, what does that mean? That means carbon dioxide has nothing to do with it, right? So you have, and that's just one aspect of the paper. Now we went and looked at the issue of isotopic evidence. Again, there's not a huge number of papers about that. There's maybe 10. Maybe I'm wrong. There's 20, but it's not a huge number because it's a very specific type of research, right? And if you look at that, there's several recent papers that show that in fact there's zero they came up with. They said undetectable or negligible evidence of a human signature in CO2 in the atmosphere for the last 200 years. If that's true, and it's a paper by a highly respected a set of papers by a highly respected hydrologist from Greece. If that's true, then that means the carbon dioxide that we are seeing in the atmosphere, and it is going up, right? This CO2 is going up, but the question is that stuff that's making it go up human CO2, or is it just CO2 from other parts of the biosphere? And
Yeah.
because remember, human CO2 is only about 4% of the biosphere, right? There's
I wanted to ask you about the content of the paper, and particularly having moved on from Grok and made that clear.
yeah,
One thing before I do that, though, I mean, I know that you've produced your paper, or Grok3 produced your paper,
yeah,
and I also know that Grok3 produced your press release as well, which was quite a good
yeah,
idea.
yeah.
But because of the press release, a number of people have commented upon your paper in different ways, and one person put the Grok3 paper, into Grok3 and asked it for a critique of it. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of those. What they tried to do early on, and this gets technical, they've sort of dwindled away now. What you have to understand about AI is um, Grok is not Grok. Okay, so what do I mean by that? when you use Grok3 Beta interactively and you put it into what it's called its think mode, because in think mode, that's the only mode in which it's truly intelligent, okay? In think mode with Grok3 interactively, then it's doing chain of thought reasoning. What does that mean? If I ask it one question, it actually breaks it down itself into maybe 50 questions or sometimes as many as 100. And it answers all those questions asking itself, well, I think he means this. And if he means this, I really have to consider these three factors. It's just like a human being thinking. It's the difference between the way I like to explain it, because it's very technical math wise in terms of neural networks, but is there's this thing called an inference pass. An inference pass is if I say to you, what's 5 times 8? You just say 40. You have no idea how you do that. You just say it. That's an inference pass. Your brain already knows that answer and it's instant. Same thing with the model. Now, when you ask a question of Grok and non-think mode, that's what it's doing. The only difference between you and the model is it has way more information, so it can do quick inference passes on huge amounts of stuff. But it's not, so if the data that was built in to its model, just like if the stuff you learned when you were a kid was biased, your brain is biased. And if I ask you a political question, you'll give an answer instantly that's biased by your, okay. So Grok will give inference pass answers that are biased left always whenever it's a politically charged subject, okay, or social, anything controversial.
It's certainly done that because the conclusion, I mean, it goes through your paper. Grok 3 goes through the Grok 3 paper.
Right, and
And
it'll give all the left-wing dogma.
yes, it does. It gives you, it raises valid points about model limitations. Its conclusions overreach, selectively interpreting evidence to downplay anthropogenic CO2's role.
Of
That's
course,
basically the
right, and
conclusion.
that is a total inference pass response. It's not a think mode response.
Right,
If
I
you
got you. Yeah,
if you give it a think mode response and you say to it, look, first of all, remember our paper is a review paper, right? So the job of a review paper is to review the sources, and this because the sources are all peer reviewed, and we included 23 IPCC sources and 21 others on these subjects, okay? And and then we told it to go and review that. So yeah, if you ask it in think mode and you say, look, this is a science review paper, there's 47 sources, 23 of this, 2 of this, go verify that and make sure that this paper accurately reflects what is said in the scientific sources, because that's what a review paper is supposed to do, right? We didn't do a new experiment. We just synthesized what
yeah,
exists.
yeah.
And when you do that, it comes back, because I've done it, it'll come back and tell you it's a 5 out of 5 review paper. Yeah. So, and the other problem is when they have this thing on Grok, on X, called the Grok responder. And if you're in a chain of a post and people are saying, they can say, hey, Grok, what do you think about this? Then the Grok responder will come in and place a response from Grok, right? And
Yeah.
what people don't understand is it's not the same model and it's not the same parameters. When you ask the Grok responder to respond, it's using, first of all, it's an older version of the model. Second of all, it's limited to 280 character responses. And third of all, it is purely an inference pass. So it's giving you an inference pass based on old data in a simpler version of the model. Whereas if you talk to it directly, interactively, put it in think mode and say, here's the full text of the paper, and here are the sources, compare the two and rate the quality of this as a review paper, it goes through and says yes, 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 yes. It's an A plus paper.
Let's go back to the content of the paper because
Sure.
I think that's the most important bit of it,
Yeah.
rather than who it's written by. And I mean, you mentioned that CO2 is human CO2 is only 4% of the total output of all the CO2 which is created. Is that widely accepted? I mean, that's a very small amount compared to the 96%
Yeah.
which is elsewhere. But is that
The,
widely accepted as a figure?
well, let me explain exactly. And the paper explains this very precisely, but let me explain it so people understand what number you're talking about. Um, I think it's widely accepted. I'm sure there's somebody who disagrees, but I think it's widely accepted that the total so-called carbon cycle is around 230 gigatons of carbon per year. And that's
Yeah.
carbon, not carbon dioxide. So we got to, people mix those two up all the time. So if you have 200, in other words, that's the amount that's going up and coming down and going up and coming down. It goes out of sources and gets sunk into sinks. And people have probably heard those terms. So it goes into the ocean, it goes into trees, et cetera. And it comes from human sources and it comes from the ocean and dirt and lots of places. Okay. The total amount of human fossil fuel burning is estimated at about 10 gigatons of carbon. So
Right.
10 divided by 230 is 4%. And I
Yeah.
don't think, I think, we cited 47 different sources in our paper, and I think they all come up with that same number. I don't think any of them disagree about. By the way, in our paper, Grok did it initially, and we continued it and made sure more than half of the cited papers in our review are ones that, let's call them IPCC leaning people, or what some people call mainstream, but mainstream is a
Yeah.
stupid, not a scientific concept, but people who believe in what the IPCC assessments say. More than half of the papers are those papers and authors who lean in that direction. Okay. So it was, I think we came up with, there were 3 data sets and there were 23 IPCC leaning sources and 21 newer, not IPCC leaning sources. So it's in terms of just numbers of papers. But yeah, the 4% number, I don't think any of them says that there's anything much different than that.
Yeah. So if it is 4%
Yeah,
produced by human beings,
right.
it seems to me rather incredible that there is so much emphasis then placed on the human production of carbon dioxide. Because when you think of it, if 96% is produced by other sources, photosynthesis and other things that you've mentioned here, why do people put such a stress on trying to reduce human carbon dioxide when that would only, even if you were to eliminate all of human carbon dioxide production to zero, the carbon zero holy grail that people are after here, you'd still have the 96%. Would it
Right.
make a great deal of difference?
Well, so um, the think of it this way: the that's often an argument made. Oh, it's a little small amount. You can't, in science, you can't just make that simplistic in an argument, because little small amounts of certain things can do huge stuff. Like a tiny amount of a poison can kill you, right?
Yes, but this is a tiny amount of the same thing that there's a lot of produced
Well,
elsewhere.
well, that's right. And so the reason they say that is because the essentially the claim is that even though it's a small amount, they claim everything was in perfect equilibrium before, and now you're adding this small amount that is, another claim is that there are positive feedbacks, as they're called. So it's amplified by positive feedbacks, and that causes a very noticeable thing. Now, we don't believe that's true at all, and this data contradicts that, but that's what the other side of the argument is. So even though it's a small numerical amount, they claim that the amplification, et cetera, causes it to be significant. So I don't think the absolute value of the number is that important, the 4%. What's important is, let me explain the isotopic thing. So
Yeah,
there's different isotopes of carbon, carbon 14, carbon 13, carbon 12. Certain fossil fuel burning is one type of carbon. I forget which one off the top of my head. And then things that come from certain types of plants is another isotope, and stuff that comes from the ocean is another. And so the balance of the isotopes in the atmosphere should be changing if we're adding human CO2 that wasn't there before, right? Because and so that's the studies that we cited in the more recent papers that show the balance is not changing in the isotopes. So that tells you that whatever is going in the atmosphere, it's the same, because 200 years ago there was no human CO2, right? We weren't burning fossil fuels. And
yeah.
so that's a new thing. If it's shown up now, and the claim is, in fact, the claim is that by the IPCC side is that half of the stuff we burn is going into the atmosphere, roughly speaking. So remember, I told you there's 10 gigatons a year of carbon. So they
Yeah.
claim that 5 gigatons of human CO2 is going into the atmosphere every year for the past, 50 years or whatever. And
Well, I'm saying there, you mean
yeah,
remaining?
well, they claim, that curve you always see going up.
Yeah.
They're claiming that that rise is largely due to human CO2. This paper shows that the studies that are cited in here show that that's not true. We're not saying that the CO2 is not rising. It is rising, but it's not coming from human CO2 according to this data that we
I
shared.
can't I can't really understand how that argument can be maintained that it's rising because of the ten tons of gigatons of
Well,
human
it's only
stuff.
rising by a teeny tiny amount. It rises by when they show you the curve, they show this curve going up like this, right? But that's because they've compressed the axes. Okay, the
Yeah.
curve, it's only going up by 2 parts per million per year. Okay, so what does that mean? For every molecule of either of air, which air is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, okay, and then it's 1% other stuff, and of the 1%, 0.4% is there's 0.4% which is CO2 of the atmosphere. So it's, and then there's some other trace gases as they're called. So for every million molecules of air, you're getting 2 more per year. That's the rate at which CO2 is rising. And human CO2 is only 4% of what is in the cycle. So it's 4% of the, it's a teeny tiny amount. And so the question is whether the stuff whether the increase in the atmosphere is actually because of human CO2. And the only way you can, CO2 molecules don't have labels on them saying this guy's human, right? So the only way you can tell is by doing sophisticated things like the isotopic analysis. And that shows that it's not. And
Yeah.
that's what this paper says. Yeah. So,
As one would expect it
yeah.
from my point of view. But
Right.
that leaves us with the question then,
Yeah.
because your paper points out quite rightly that the CO2 concentrations have moved. They've gone from 280 parts per million a few hundred years ago, and they're now up to about 420 parts per million. That's almost, well, it's not quite double, but it's getting on for that.
Right.
How do we explain that increase of parts per million over that length of time?
Well, Um, so another aspect in our paper, which cites again several peer-reviewed papers, was a detailed stochastic analysis to determine whether you have two related phenomena. If we look at throughout history of temperature and carbon dioxide, and throughout history, I don't know if you remember the Al Gore movie, right? And he showed the big graph of the carbon dioxide and the temperature over the last
Yeah.
800,000 years or something. And what he didn't show, and what was fake about that, and which is why it was sort of outlawed in the UK, they weren't allowed to show it without saying, "Hey, this stuff is wrong," um,
Mm.
is that the rises in temperature. I'm sorry, the rises in carbon dioxide at every significant place where it changed followed the rises in temperature by anywhere from 800 to a few thousand years. In other words, the temperature of the earth went up, and 800 or 1,000 or 2,000 years later the carbon dioxide went up. Now, when when you have a causal analysis, the first thing that's a requirement for a causal analysis is that it be precedent. In other words, the thing that's doing the causing has to happen first. Okay. And so Now, what the other side will say was, well, yes, the temperature went up, and then the carbon dioxide went up, but then there was feedback, and so that caused the temperature to go up more. Of course, that is a whole other question and very questionable. But what the new papers did in 2023 and 4 is they did a very careful stochastic analysis of the relationship between temperature and CO2. And first they did it for the most recent couple hundred years, and then they extended the analysis, did another paper extending it back 500 million years, by the way. Okay. And they investigated whether temperature caused CO2, whether CO2 caused temperature, or whether they both cause each other, and there is some sort of feedback. And they did a very sophisticated analysis, stochastical analysis that had never been done before, and came up conclusively with the answer, as conclusive as a science paper can be. But it was a very firm, put it this way, it was a very strong conclusion. I can read you what they said, that temperature to CO2 is a unidirectional thing. And if you want the exact quote, it's probably in our paper, or it's
So
in
by unidirectional, you mean that
meaning the temperature of the globe goes up, and that causes the
that
CO2 in the
causes the
atmosphere to
CO2.
go
The
up.
CO2 does not cause the temperature,
And
but the
CO2
temperature
does
rise
not
causes
cause
the
the temperature
CO2.
to go up. Correct. That's what it showed. And we know of many mechanisms whereby the simplest mechanism is that the ocean has 38,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide in it, okay? And when you raise if the temperature of the earth goes up a little, that raises the temperature of the ocean a little. And when you raise the temperature of a liquid, gases that are dissolved in it outgas. So, and remember, 38,000 gigatons, a couple hundred gigatons is the cycle. So a tiny change in the ocean could cause a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide to come out, right? So that's one mechanism. We don't get into the mechanisms because that's an extremely sinks and sources is an extremely complex problem that nobody has totally solved. So this paper is focused on published science where they have good evidence and empirical science with real numbers from data. And that empirical paper about causation, shows very firmly that the temperature to CO2 is a unidirectional causation.
Well, that makes sense to me as a physicist. If I was to take some carbonated water, some soda water, and put it on a pan and heat it up slowly, the CO2 would start coming out of it. So as the temperature goes up, you would see more CO2 being produced.
Correct.
But if it is that way round, if it is that temperature causes the CO2 and the CO2 does not cause the temperature increases, then the question has to be, what causes the temperature increases if it's not the CO2?
Well, that's again a huge question, and there are many, many things that cause temperature to go up. And so in this paper, we talked about 4 or 5 different possibilities. Number one was the total solar irradiance. People
Yeah.
don't realize all of the energy for the Earth comes from the sun. They think, oh, there's internal energy, there's this and that. The total amount of energy inside the Earth, even everything added together, is a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the amount of energy that comes from the sun. So all the energy for our system and our weather system comes from the sun. Now, the theory, again, of that paper I told you about, PMOD, is that it hasn't changed. The amount of change has been so small that it couldn't have caused the rise that we think we've observed. Even the rise that we think we've observed is a fishy thing because it's very hard to measure. They measure it with these sparsely distributed thermometers on a tiny fraction of the Earth's surface and then try to adjust it. But even if you believe the amount of temperature rise they talk about, they typically say, most papers say, 1 degree over the last 100 years, 1 degree centigrade or something like that, right? And but a tiny change in the solar irradiance can account for all of that. And remember, I told you about the satellites that are measuring that. Those data sets, depending on how you marry them together, If we had had one satellite that could have measured it for constantly for 30 years with one set of instruments that were calibrated properly, we might have a better answer on that question. But the fact of the matter is we don't. We have like 10 different satellites, and there's 27 different ways, possibly 40 different ways of calculating what they say. And some of those ways show a small increase in total solar irradiance, enough to account for all the warming we think we've seen, right? So that's the big thing in science. You have uncertainty. And I'm not talking about theories here. I'm talking about published peer-reviewed papers based on data, which is, by the way, the other thing you got to watch out for nowadays is there are a lot of peer-reviewed papers nowadays whose conclusions are totally drawn from models. Okay, and models are not evidence, because any model you build, I don't care how simple or complicated the model is, it's fundamentally a belief, right? F equals ma is a belief. Force equals mass times acceleration is a belief. It's a model. It's not a fact. Okay. In fact, it's wrong. We know it's wrong.
Yeah.
For 200 years we thought it was right. Einstein came along. He came up with a better one, of which F equals ma was a special case. Okay.
Mm.
But then, okay, now we have Einstein's. We also know that Einstein's theory is wrong. It's a very good model, though, because for most of the things we look at, it's unbelievably precise. You can do experiments with and using Einstein's theory and come up with answers that have 20 digits after the decimal point. But we also know it's wrong, because we know of areas where it totally doesn't work. So
Mm.
therefore, it's not a correct model.
And the IPCC models, if I've looked at them briefly, they seem very crude to me,
Oh, they're
because
massively crude. Yeah.
because
And
you take the entire Earth's surface and you divide it up into little segments, maybe a million or so segments. I forget how many they've got, and then you implement certain um, assumptions as to how the temperatures changes from one segment to another segment, and surprisingly enough, they come up with some answers, but they're not always um, accurately portraying what the empirical evidence is.
no, in
Um,
fact, they've never agreed with the empirical evidence, and they fabricated this notion of what they call the model mean, right? Because they'll have 100 models, and none of the models come close to reality. So they say, well, let's not look at the models. We'll look at the average of the 100 models. Okay,
yeah,
and then they say, oh, and then even with the average of the 100 models, it still doesn't really come close to reality. So we say we'll look at the slope of the linear trend of the average of the 100 models. And then we say, look, it's going up. And they say, it's matched. No, it isn't matched. The models don't match. And by the way, the logic for doing the model mean, this is a little technical, but the logic for doing that is what's called the central limit theorem.
yeah,
The central limit theorem, I won't give you the math of it, but basically the idea is, if you're trying to measure something that is real and measurable, like the temperature at this point in space, I could take a thermometer and measure it, right? And then write it down. And I could take another thermometer and measure it and write it down. I could keep measuring it over and over again, maybe even with the same thermometer multiple times. I keep writing down the numbers. And each time I measure it, I'm going to get a slightly different number. But over time, the central limit theorem says that will average out, and the average will approach the actual temperature. But the conditions under which that works is if all the measurements are independent, and if the errors inherent in the independent measurements are randomly distributed. Okay. So
yeah,
when you use the models that we're talking about here are computer programs. Okay. It's well documented and well known that roughly 50% of the code, which was written in Fortran, 30 years ago, in those models is shared amongst all these models. So that, first of all, the models themselves are not independent. They have huge
yeah,
amounts of code. Forget about the actual code, the physics that they incorporate. And remember, physics is just theory. Physics is not fact. Physics is theory. The only thing that's fact is the real world. I like the way Lord Kelvin said it. He said, science is numbers. And John Clauser said, he said, science is looking at the real world. Okay. So, when you measure these things, when you look at these models, they're not independent. Furthermore, because you're doing long time series Navier-Stokes equations, these things diverge, they wiggle wildly. When we talk
Yeah.
about F equals ma, if you do an experiment and draw the graph, it matches it exactly at every point. If you do one of these models and then put up the balloon data set, it wildly wiggles all over the place. It's nowhere near it. The R squared correlation is almost zero. So when these people say these models model reality, no. What they're saying is they go up and the temperature has gone up. But in fact, they go up 2 and 3 times faster than what, in fact, that's another aspect we talked about in this paper. If you
Mm.
look at what the models say, even just for the slope, it's 2 to 3 times what we measure in with real measuring devices.
Mm.
So
Good. Okay. Can I move you on to something slightly different, which is a difference between the IPCC approach and your approach. I want you to talk about that. And that is that I'm told that the IPCC uses adjusted data sets. And in your case, you've used unadjusted data sets. Can you explain that difference to us and why you've got a different approach?
yeah, we and we used publicly available data sets that are the sort of the reference best ones. If you go in the paper, um, they're called like reference network, USCRN and others. Um, when they do adjustments, some adjustments are probably valid. Okay, um, when you have a weather station and it's moved to a different location, um, an adjustment needs to be made to make its data comparable to what it was before. Or, but there are other types of adjustments which are just calculations, so-called homogenization. That's one of the worst, the pairwise homogenization adjustment. And it's been shown in lots of peer-reviewed studies now that creates bias. But the macroscopic big problem and big question of adjustments is that if you look, for example, at the NOAA data and their graph of what they graph as global warming, and you look at the raw data of NOAA's network and what they publish, the size of the warming is equal to the warming of the adjustments. Do you understand what that means? In other words,
Yeah, are you
the
saying
entire warming signal is due to the
yeah,
adjustments. Now they
are
claim,
you
oh, but
saying that the adjustments that doesn't mean the adjustments are wrong, does it?
no, but it
The
certainly makes them suspect, doesn't it?
Well, what it may mean is that there is a temperature rise of that amount, and the adjustments were necessary in order to show it.
It could be. That's correct. But there are other studies, and in this paper that we cite, that show, for example, there's a study on the best network of thermometers is the northern the United States network, right? The
Yes,
USCRN. Okay, and so there was an extensive study done in 2023, and I think this was the one by like it's this. I think it's the same one that did the TSI stuff. They looked at there was 40 scientists or so that did this, and they looked at the northern hemisphere stuff, and they divided the thermometers up into two sets: the rural and the urban. So the urban ones are the ones that are near cities, okay? And
yeah,
cities is well known that they've gotten warmer and much warmer, like
yeah.
10 degrees warmer, a lot warmer because of the asphalt and all and the crowding and the cars and the people and so forth. So when you look, in fact, if you go to any city, if you're in New York City and then you drive 100 miles out into the country, you'll see a 5 or 10 degree drop in temperature. Okay. That's called the urban heat island effect, sometimes called UHI. So they did a study in 2023 to see how much warming this accounted for by looking at rural stations only versus rural plus urbanized, which is what the big index is like NOAA. They use all the stations. They don't isolate out only rural ones. When you look at the only the rural ones, that study showed that as much as 45% of the warming disappeared when you looked at um, or maybe it was the flip side. It said that 45% of the warming could be accounted for by the UHI. So you got 45% less warming when you did only rural stations, right? So, and most of the stations in the world that exist, and the largest numbers in the US, but they're all over the world, except they're not in the oceans and they're not on the polar caps. There's tiny numbers, right? But anyhow, this urban heat island effect is a huge thing. And so if that alone can account for 45%, if the TSI alone could account for the whole thing or half or part, if the carbon dioxide is not human, if and all of these conclusions are based on published peer-reviewed science, and we went through about 5, 6 different areas like this. They all say the same thing, which is there's something that needs more evaluation here, and that's why we called it a critical
Yeah.
reassessment. In fact, but this even that we didn't write. That Grok wrote that headline, by the way.
I've got a similar example for that here in the UK, because I think last summer there was a lot of newspaper headlines about we've reached the highest possible temperature, or the highest temperature we've ever reached before. I think we almost got to 40 degrees, which is unprecedented here. But when you drill down to find out where that temperature was, you find it was just one station. And that one station was only at that temperature for 30 seconds and no longer than that. And the station was actually situated next to a runway
Right. Of
where
course.
aeroplanes
Complete
were going past at any moment. So
completely meaningless. That's right.
yeah, that's the difficulty here.
When you
But
look back in the United States, we had what we called the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, the temperatures were much warmer than now in the United States, and there's no question about that. But
um, Jonathan, we're coming to the end of our time. I don't know where the hour's gone, actually. It's been a very interesting conversation. But I just wanted to ask you about looking forward to the future as to where we're going. I don't know if your country, the US, is like our country here in the UK, but we are hell-bent on uh, eliminating all human carbon production, which is called net zero. And we have a target of getting to net zero by 2050. And it's going to cost trillions of pounds or dollars here in order to do that. Is that, what's your comment on that?
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not a political type I'm not into that sphere. But if you're asking me what I personally believe,
Yeah,
based on all the science I've read, I think it's the biggest scam in human history. It's totally ridiculous. And our paper is just one of many, many papers that point seriously against the. I mean, as you can see, our paper calls the entire carbon dioxide philosophy into question
yeah.
in a
But
huge way. Not in a.
why are there so many people strongly committed to
Well,
this
that's a
point of
political
view?
issue. It was, and the IPCC was created in the late 80s with the stated mission of finding the global warming and telling the policymakers to make policy based on it. So it was always a political driven mission. Now you can there's all kinds of theories about global control and transfer of wealth and globalist policy versus populist policy, and that's a big political
Yes,
science
yes.
argument, but the IPCC was the linchpin for driving it because they then censored, lied, created this fake consensus, pretended that the IPCC was science when it's never been science. It was always politics. It was always run by politicians. Let me tell you one fact about the IPCC that most people don't know. People
Yeah,
hear about the IPCC, they say thousands of scientists peer reviewed. Okay, it's a lie. First of all, there's one section of the IPCC called the Working Group 1. That's where the physical science is. that entire report was initially authored by 230 something lead authors who were scientists. It was then approved and edited by others, but 230 scientists for that whole report. All the other reports are different. Okay, now, in the average number of lead authors per chapter of that, and I think there's, I forget how many chapters, 14 or 15, but the average number of lead authors per chapter is 13, 1-3, not 100, not 1,000, not 50, 1-3. Now, the only chapter that really matters to me, and I'm sure there's lots of other valuable stuff in the report, but the only one that matters to me is human. There's one chapter on human causation. Because if we're not causing it, it's more of a question about mitigation and dealing with it, right? And
Yeah.
all the other stuff goes away if we're not the cause, right? So the chapter on human causation was lead authors 11, so not even a dozen. Okay. Now wait, we're not done yet because this is important. Nobody knows this, and this is the scam. Any given subsection of the human causation chapter, and there's many different subsections on totally different pieces of science, right? Any given subsection is typically written by 2 or 3, count them, 1, 2, 3 lead authors. Okay, now all of these lead authors are chosen by the governments. They all work for institutions that are funded by the governments, and their output is edited and approved by the governments. Now, I'm not done yet. So we got down to 3 scientists now, right? Now, and let's say the subsection you're talking about is the isotopic evidence. Their conclusion is based on 1 paper. So this is not a huge, the only reason it's a huge assessment is because they cover many different subjects, right? And they have many chapters that have nothing to do with science. They're summaries for policymakers and other things like that, or big statements that they can pump out to the press that are only half truths, right? When you get down to where's the science being done, in the critical sections, go to the section, try and find in the IPCC report the discussion of solar irradiance, and you will discover that it boils down to 1 paper. Okay, 1 paper.
This contrasts very strongly, Jonathan, with the constant assertion that climate change is a settled science
Right.
and agreed by 97% of all scientists.
Right. That's a total lie. And it was very cleverly fabricated and promulgated using military style psyops, but it's a lie from every angle. The 97% number was fabricated from fake numbers from a psychologist named John Cook. That paper was totally debunked. The numbers don't say 97% anywhere. Okay. And but even if they did, it wouldn't matter because science isn't decided by vote, right?
Exactly.
But my point, I could give you a whole talk about that, where that 97% number came, but it's a total lie. No survey has ever been done. No survey of any group of scientists has ever been done where 97% of them agreed. In fact, that paper, the original paper where that came from wasn't a survey. It was a so-called analysis of abstracts from science papers. So now you got to say, well, wait, how did you do the analysis? And what exactly did the abstracts say? And can you tell what a scientist believes by words in an abstract? And by the way, were all the numbers that you quoted wrong? So don't let me go there. But the point is that none of that matters when when you say they all agree. The question is, what are you talking about? What is it they agree on? Give me one particular subject. Let's take a particular subject like isotopic evidence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
I think they're more general than that. I think what they're saying is that 97% of scientists agree that global warming is caused by human activity.
Right, and that's a total lie. Show me one survey of scientists that shows that. First of all, how do you know when some people agree? Okay, that's what's called politics. We know that people agree in the U.S. Senate because they take a vote, right?
Mm.
So we get a vote. It's 51 to 49. So we know that 51 of them agreed, and that was the majority. Okay. So you show me, name one survey of scientists. And first of all, tell me who these scientists were, because if you're going to survey them, you need to know who they are and what the exact number of them is. And then you got to count them, and then you got to show me their votes. It doesn't exist. It's all fabricated. It's completely made up lie, very cleverly made up lies, I must admit, and cleverly promulgated by politicians and specialists in military psychological operations. But it's a
Trouble with this,
total fabrication.
yeah, the trouble with this fabrication, though, is that it weighs very heavily
Oh,
with the general
absolutely.
public,
Yeah,
because they think that because you have a great weight of opinion, that's kind of proved it. But of course, science, as you said, doesn't work like that. I'm
right,
reminded of a story about Einstein, that when he was in Germany or just left Germany in the 1930s, the Nazi government didn't actually like his conclusion because he was Jewish, and so Hitler or his regime got 100 scientists to
right.
write against Einstein.
That's
And
right.
Einstein was informed of this. He said, you realize 100 scientists have written to say that your theories are wrong. And Einstein's reply was a classic. He said, if it was wrong, it would only take one.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's a
So
very famous story. Yeah.
yes, it's not by consensus. And I think where the world is often pushed along a road where consensus is like groupthink. It keeps everyone moving in the right direction as long as the government is happy with it. But unfortunately, it may not turn out that way in the end.
Well, that's why other people much smarter than me, Judith Curry or Willie Soon or Richard Lindzen have coined the phrase. I forget who coined it first, but they call it a manufactured consensus. It doesn't really exist. It's
Yeah.
just created. It's an illusion that's been created, just like the illusion of thousands of scientists. I just boiled it down for you. The thousands of scientists is really three or two,
Yeah.
and the zillions of peer-reviewed papers is really one in all the critical cases. Now, there, if you say, well, oh, they mentioned other papers, yeah, there are ancillary papers in there. But if you say, well, where is it that they conclude that the solar irradiance doesn't change? One paper. Where is it that they conclude that the isotopic evidence of carbon dioxide is one paper? So, and who decided that? Right? What about all these other papers that exist that you totally ignored? And much more recent ones using much better methodologies, right? Science proceeds by, you got this, then you got this, then you got this, and usually you get better because the newer papers cite the older ones. That's it's like kind of like law, it's precedent. You say, well, okay, these guys said this, but now we're going to take that a step further and look deeper and go into more detail. And so the actual truth is we found that in every area we looked at with solar irradiance, the urban heat island effect, the carbon dioxide resident, and the residence time. Another area that they totally gloss over and tell stories about is in the IPCC, they made up this model based thing called adjustment time of CO2. Every other scientist who has studied and done a paper on this in the last 20 years, including several recent ones, says that CO2 turns over in the atmosphere in about 3 or 4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
In the IPCC, they say it's hundreds to thousands of years, except they gloss over the fact that they're creating a new concept based on models, which they call adjustment time, which is not CO2 turnover time. And so, again, we talked about that in this paper as well. So,
I'm going to put a link to the paper in the video here. But Jonathan Cohler, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation on climate change. Thank you.
you're very welcome.